I want to begin by paying tribute to the people of Puerto Rico who have been through unimaginable disaster, a natural disaster, not of their making, and a financial disaster, not any more of their fault than the hurricane that they have endured. They have persevered, and indeed now are surviving and even thriving, despite the hurdles placed in their way by this kind of huge, humongous storm that destroyed parts of their island. And in fact, even now, at least a quarter of their water is undrinkable. More than 80% of their electricity is down. Many of the roads are impassable. Their schools are largely closed. Their island is paralyzed, or at least largely paralyzed so far as economic progress and job creation are concerned. They don't deserve this fate. They are Americans. They've fought in our wars. I've been privileged to spend time with the Buccaneers and led the effort to award them a Congressional Gold Medal simply as a sign of their patriotism and their dedication to our country. They are not only Americans, they are patriotic Americans. And so too are the first responders and military and others from states around the country who have gone to Puerto Rico to help with relief. I want to recognize their courage and sacrifice and service to our nation. The National Guard from Connecticut, who have gone to the island to help with National Guard from at least 13 states. There are thousands of them now. And they are working with men and women on the ground from FEMA, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security generally, our military. They deserve our thanks. And yet, for all that heroic work, this nation is failing Puerto Rico. Americans are on the verge of failing fellow Americans. Puerto Rico has a population of about 3.4 million people, roughly the size of Connecticut. If the humanitarian crisis now ongoing in Puerto Rico occurred in Connecticut, there would be an outcry and outrage of unprecedented proportion, comparable to a public surge of criticism unseen before. And yet, the people of Puerto Rico endure this humanitarian crisis seemingly without response. The President of the United States gives himself a 10. I agree. He deserves a 10 if the grading scale is 1 to 100, because barely a tenth, in fact, less than a tenth of what this nation owes to Puerto Rico has been done for them. I flew over the island of Puerto Rico in a Sikorsky Black Hawk during a recent trip, a bipartisan trip, and saw out of the side of that Black Hawk devastation and destruction that I never thought I would see in America. Whole towns flattened, homes razed to the ground, community centers destroyed, power lines dangling and down. And I heard from the Corps of Engineers that there is no timetable to repair those lines, to restore electricity, which is the lifeblood of civilization and essential to bare economic functioning, let alone progress going forward, which is what the island needs. And from what I hear that families have told me, the shortages of food and water and medicine persist. The hospitals depend on generators that are sometimes non-functional, and medicine is lacking in those hospitals. So what's at stake in Puerto Rico is really our humanity. In the midst of this humanitarian crisis, what's challenged is our humanity. Not just the legality or the protocols, but our basic instincts to help fellow Americans when they need it. This nation should not have a double standard for disaster relief. The Americans of Puerto Rico deserve what Connecticut would receive. And I have stood in Connecticut with our Puerto Rican community, and we're proud of the fact that we have more Puerto Rican community per capita than any other state in the country. That community has given back to Connecticut, has contributed to our quality of life, and we are proud of all of our Puerto Ricans who have come to the island in past generations or just recently. And I've stood with Gladys Rivera, who lived in Connecticut, went to Puerto Rico, and has just come back. With the Bermudez family, with deep ties and families there and here, with Jason Ortiz, and I could list many others. He is in charge of the Puerto Rican agenda. And they have given me a picture of that humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico that speaks to my heart about families that continue to suffer and endure these hardships. So the measure that we are passing today is a tiny down payment on what is needed for Puerto Rico. It is a short-term, very small sign of what we owe. A down payment that must be followed by a much bigger, longer-term commitment, a Marshall Plan, that will enable the island not just to repair those power lines or the roads, but rebuild with different kinds of power, renewables and solar, not dependent on diesel or coal, stronger, more resilient structures, whether it's home or commercial building, that can withstand future hurricanes. What's needed in Puerto Rico is not just repair, but true rebuilding and recovery, and not just the physical structures, but the sense of financial stability and progress. And so the pittance in this supplemental for Puerto Rico is the least we can do. In fact, it is less than the least we can do, because it actually adds to the debt that Puerto Rico now has. It adds $5 billion to the $74 billion that is owed by Puerto Rico. It does nothing about the bankruptcy of PREPA, the power company. It alleviates in no way the financial burdens of debt. In fact, adds to it. And instinctively, we know in this chamber that we have an obligation to do more. There have been too many reports to fill this record today about the courage of Puerto Rico, about the burdens that it has to endure. We have seen and heard enough to know that a longer-term plan is necessary, a Marshall Plan, that there is stronger leadership necessary, that leadership has been lacking. And so I have proposed a disaster relief czar who can cut through the red tape and the bureaucratic lack of cohesion and get this job done, who can tell the Corps of Engineers what the deadlines are and bring together the leadership of Puerto Rico and give them the empowering authority in resources, not just in words. And I've called as well for the CDC to be engaged more actively and effectively, because Puerto Rico now faces a potential epidemic of mosquito-borne diseases, dengue fever, Zika, chikungunya. The standing pools of water throughout the island, and I've seen them, pose a real public health threat at a time when the island is ill-equipped to deal with it. I've begun working with my colleagues on a longer-term plan because this measure must be followed by stronger, more robust steps. The damage done to the island was in the range of $100 billion. That is a rough estimate. That $100 billion must not only be reinvested, it must be used to provide resilience, real investment, real rebuilding. That's what's necessary for Puerto Rico. I hope to return and visit again shortly. But in the meantime, the voices and faces of our fellow Americans there come to us clearly through my friends and neighbors in Connecticut who have joined with me in this call for action, for real action and real rebuilding and real investment. Much more than this short-term down payment, which will shortchange the island if we do no more. It must be simply a next step, a first step that we owe our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico.